This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. Only last Thursday, as evidence of this rapid offensive buildup was already in my hand, Soviet Foreign Minister Gromyko told me in my office that he was instructed to make it clear once again, as he said his government had already done, that Soviet assistance to Cuba, and I quote, pursued solely the purpose of contributing to the defense capabilities of Cuba, unquote. That, and I quote him, training by Soviet specialists of Cuban nationals in handling defensive armaments was by no means offensive. And that if it were otherwise, Mr. Gromyko went on, the Soviet government would never become involved in rendering such assistance, unquote. That statement also was false. Acting therefore in the defense of our own security and of the entire Western Hemisphere, and under the authority entrusted to me by the Constitution, as endorsed by the resolution of the Congress, I have directed that the following initial steps be taken immediately. To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, will, if found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back.
The plan, now Eisenhower later said, I guess, that under his administration there was no plan, there was a program. In other words, we decided we were going to get rid of Castro. That's the program. But we didn't have any plans about how you're going to do it. That's the way I interpret that.
Yeah, it's a semantic difference. I'm not really sure. It meant a lot to Eisenhower. It's never really meant a lot to anyone else.
Yeah, okay.
I think what he meant by a program is, I mean, Eisenhower had this for a year. And a lot of things were done under Eisenhower. You had training camps in Guatemala. You had an air force being assembled for the Cuban exiles to take out Castro. You had ships. I mean, a huge amount of logistical stuff happening. An invasion really being prepared. And you have Eisenhower supporting it. In fact, even suggesting shortly before he left the presidency to make it bigger. But he did later say, well, you know, it wasn't a plan. And I think what he meant is there was no green light. And there also no landing site had been chosen yet. I mean, a lot of what Eisenhower would have considered to be a plan, a full plan, was not yet in place. But the whole snowball was rolling and was very large by the time that Eisenhower left office. So and I think he tried to remove himself from any blame. And I think that he was being a bit unfair to Kennedy. Yeah, yeah. This didn't just start the day Kennedy came into office. It was this, I said a snowball, really more like a freight train. And Kennedy basically didn't know what to do to stop it.
It would be like saying we had no plan to invade Normandy in March of 1944.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
It's something that President Eisenhower said to me on January 19th. He said, there are no easy matters will ever come to you as president. If they're easy, they will be settled at a lower level. So the matters that finally come to you as president are always the difficult matters, and matters which carry with them large implications. So this contributes to some of the burdens of the office of the presidency, which other presidents have commented on.
Plans, programs, call it whatever you will. I mean, the general idea is that they were disastrously bad, isn't it?
The idea to well, I mean, there were many plans, programs.
Well, you know, like where they're going to land.
Yeah.
Who's going to fly air cover, those kinds of things.
Yeah. I am. So go against the conventional wisdom a little bit and maybe defend the CIA a little. Not that they didn't make enormous mistakes, and not that it wasn't a bad idea, not that it wasn't a disaster. But I think it was from the CIA was handed this. Richard Bissell, the deputy director of operations, was the guy in charge, and he was told, go get rid of Castro. And in the end, this was the best plan they could come up with, and nobody had any better ideas. And it was not perhaps as boneheaded as it now seems. The idea was to land about 1,400 Cuban exiles on a number of 3 beaches on the southern side of Cuba around the area of the Bay of Pigs. And it was never that these 1,400 men were then going to push into Cuba and defeat Castro's army of 25 or 30,000. The idea was that they were going to hold this beachhead for a week, maybe 10 days, and that simply by holding on to this beachhead, they could, first of all, give an incentive to any Cubans who didn't like Castro to come join them, to rise up against Castro, that it would be a spark for some internal revolution within Cuba. That would never have happened, but that was one hope.
How could they get to the beach?
Exactly. How could they get to the beach? But even if they were in other places, the problem is there weren't that many anti-Castro Cubans left in Cuba because they were all in Miami or they were in jail. I mean, there really weren't that many left.
And those that were in Cuba, Castro put in.
He rounded them up on the shortly before the invasion.
Yeah.
But the plan was so you hold this beachhead, hope that things happen internally in Cuba, and then you have a provisional government that's been assembled in Miami. You fly them in a few days in after you've got a hold of this beachhead, and they declare themselves the rightful leadership of Cuba. Now again, this might be an incentive to anti-Castro Cubans to come join the cause, but always in the plan from the beginning was the idea that then this government, this provisional government, could invite the United States government to come in overtly or quasi-overtly and help out, just give some aid. And this would be a foot in the door for the United States legally, without looking like they were just coming in to help some poor freedom fighters rather than themselves invading Cuba. And the idea that they could have held this beachhead, that too is not completely insane, because there was these beaches and then there was a vast swamp. And there were only 3 roads through this swamp. There was really no other way to get through the swamp other than take these 3 roads. And if you could hold those 3 roads, didn't matter how many people Castro had coming at you, you could have these chokeholds there and they couldn't get by. But this leads to the really big problem with what happened in the Bay of Pigs invasion. This all depended on Fidel Castro having no airplanes.
Yeah.
And the plan always meant for these Cuban exile pilots to go in and destroy Castro's planes on the ground. And so this was done on April 15th, 2 days before the invasion, in a preliminary strike, and about half the planes were destroyed, but there were still 7 planes left. And there was supposed to be a follow-up airstrike on the morning of April 17th that would take out the rest of Castro's Air Force. But on the night of April 16th, Kennedy canceled that follow-up airstrike. And to this day, this is what makes Cuban exiles, particularly those who were involved in this, despise Kennedy.
Why did he cancel it?
He canceled them for political reasons. After the first airstrikes, it became very apparent to the entire world that the United States was behind this. The CIA had come up with a few methods to try to avert attention and make it look like it was an internal Cuban event, but nobody bought those.
Like the guy who flew to...
Yeah, there's a guy who flew, he's actually flying from Nicaragua, but he pretended he was a Cuban, said that he's flown from Cuba, he lands in Miami, claims that he and a number of other pilots in the Cuban Air Force that morning decided to rebel against Castro and bomb their own airfields. In fact, those airfields had been bombed by this fleet of American-purchased airplanes flown by Cuban exile pilots that had flown from Nicaragua and had bombed those airfields. But in any event, very quickly this whole ruse comes undone. And then it's often blamed on Adlai Stevenson. Poor Adlai Stevenson gets blamed for anything that went wrong in the Eisenhower, in the Kennedy administration.
Yeah.
He had been promised that there wasn't going to be anything like this happening. A General Assembly in the UN he's the ambassador to the UN for the United States. The General Assembly is just beginning, and he's caught unawares by this, and he writes a letter a cable to Dean Rusk saying, "This is awful, these airstrikes. You've put me in a very awkward position." You know, later then it was blamed on Stevenson that cable is why Kennedy canceled the second airstrike. Really, though, it was a whole number of things. Kennedy just realized the American hand is showing, and if we send in another round of airstrikes, we're only going to escalate tensions that are already there. So he canceled them. But that was really the end of the invasion right then and there, even though the invasion hadn't even landed yet.
The assault has begun on the dictatorship of Fidel Castro. Cuban Army pilots opened the first phase of organized revolt with bombing raids on 3 military bases. 2 of the B-26 light bombers then seek asylum in Florida. On the heels of the air raids, landings were effected by rebels at several places on the Cuban coast, and the rebellion against the red-tinged dictator was on, with the refugee pilot claiming a full-scale army revolt near. In Havana, Acting Foreign Minister Olivares shows diplomats rockets fired from the Cuban raiders, which he claims have U.S. marking. Meanwhile, at the United Nations, Cuban Foreign Minister Roa accused the United States of unleashing a war of invasion. Roa says the invading soldiers trained in Florida, but Ambassador Stevenson makes a quick denial.
These charges are totally false, and I deny them categorically. The United States has committed no aggression against Cuba, and no offensive has been launched from Florida or from any other part of the United States.
Shouldn't they have called it off?
Yes, they probably should have. But the problem is, by the time they got the word that Kennedy definitely was canceling these airstrikes, it was about 11 o'clock at night. The invasion started to land at 12 o'clock at night. They probably, if they worked very quickly, could have relayed the information to the boats. I think partly what kept them from doing that is they thought if they tried to cancel the operation at that point, there would be an absolute mutiny on these Cuban exiles were, ready to go, and that they couldn't turn it back at that point. But I'm not sure. Maybe somebody in the CIA could have urgently stopped this thing. Maybe they should have done that. Because what happened is they start to land, and then these remaining planes of Castro's fly in over the beach. And Castro says to them, "Don't worry about the men. Get the ships, bomb the ships." And immediately, that morning of April 17th, as the invasion's happening, they take out 2 of the ships, 2 of the 6 supply ships. And then the other 4 ships head out for the horizon to avoid being bombed themselves.
Yeah.
Well, down with those 2 ships, away with those 4 ships, go most of the medical supplies, their ammunition, their food, communications equipment, and pretty much any hope that they'd ever had of this thing working out in any way. They are instantly marooned there with Castro's planes flying over them, bombing them at will, and then Castro brings in his artillery, and they do a pretty good job of holding him off at these chokeholds, at these roads. But those planes are devastating because they can come in and hit the men behind the lines. But the worst problem is there's no ammunition. So they run out of ammunition trying to hold these chokeholds. So it dissolves very, very quickly. And it really, the beginning of the end was canceling those follow-up airstrikes.
What a blank up. What a blank up.
Yeah.
I would say that the problems are more difficult than I imagined them to be. The responsibilities placed in the United States are greater than I imagined them to be, and there are greater limitations upon our ability to bring about a favorable result than I had imagined them to be. And I think that's probably true of anyone who becomes president, because there is such a difference between those who advise or speak or legislate, and between the man who must select from the various alternatives proposed and say that this shall be the policy of the United States. Well, it's much easier to make the speeches than it is to finally make the judgments, because unfortunately your advisors are frequently divided. If you take the wrong course, and on occasion I have, the President bears the burden, responsibility quite rightly. The advisors may move on to new advice.
Well, Mr. President, that brings up a point that's always interested me. How does a president go about making a decision, like Cuba, for example?
The most recent one was hammered out, really, our policy and decision over a period of 5 or 6 days. During that period, the 15 people, more or less, who were directly consulted, frequently changed their view because whatever action we took had so many disadvantages to it. And each action that we took raised the prospect that it might escalate with the Soviet Union into a nuclear war. Finally, however, I think a general consensus developed and certainly seemed, after all alternatives were examined, that the course of action that we finally adopted was the right one. Now, when I talked to members of the Congress, several of them suggested a different alternative when we confronted them on that Monday with the evidence. My feeling is that if they had gone through the 5-day period we had gone through at looking at the various alternatives, the advantages and disadvantages of action, they probably would have come out the same way that we did. I think we took the right one. If we had had to act on the Wednesday in the first 24 hours, I don't think probably we would have chosen as prudently as we finally did, a quarantine against the use of offensive weapons. In addition, that had much more power than we first thought it did, because I think the Soviet Union was very reluctant to have us stop ships which carried with them a good deal of their highly secret and sensitive material. One of the reasons I think that the Soviet Union withdrew the IL-28s was because we were carrying on very intensive low-level photography. Now, no one would have guessed, probably, that that would have been such a harassment. Mr. Castro could not permit us to indefinitely continue widespread flights over his island at 200 feet every day. And yet he knew if he shot down one of our planes that then it would bring back a much more serious reprisal on him. So it's very difficult to always make judgments here about what the effect will be of our decisions on other countries. In this case, it seemed to me that we did pick the right one. In Cuba of 1961, we picked the wrong one.
Didn't Kennedy understand? I mean, he had been in war. Didn't he understand that if you have not only don't have air superiority over the beaches, you don't have any air over the beaches?
Right.
What if that had been Normandy?
Yeah. Well, I think Kennedy did mess up, no question about it. But again, I tried in this book. It sounds like I'm being hard on Kennedy. I tried very hard to put myself into everybody's shoes and think, well, why did they make these decisions? Let's assume that these are well-meaning, intelligent people. Why would they have made these decisions? And I think with Kennedy, you just have to keep in mind the stakes that as he saw them. That to escalate anything could lead to devastating consequences. And that I think by the time he canceled those airstrikes, he must have known. He must have known that he was abandoning these guys. And it's very hard to forgive him for that. But he did it not because he was ruthless and callous. He did it because he thought if he kept escalating, that the Soviet Union would come into this.
Now, this is very ironic because by doing nothing, and over the last few nights they keep playing the part of his speech in the missile crisis where he says it would be even worse to do nothing.
Right.
Well, by doing nothing here, he brought on nearly the end of the world, because Khrushchev...
You're saying in the Cuban Missile Crisis or in the Bay of Pigs?
In the Bay of Pigs.
Yeah.
It brought on the missile crisis,
Yeah.
which was almost the end of the world,
Right.
because Khrushchev apparently understood when he met with Kennedy in Vienna between these two crises.
Yeah.
He's dealing with a weakling.
Right. That's certainly Kennedy knew that he had done that, and that they met in Vienna in June, right after the invasion, and Khrushchev just ate his lunch. I mean, it was rough. Kennedy afterwards said that he got savaged.
Yeah.
And it must be because of the Bay of Pigs. He must think I'm weak.
Yeah.
And that's true. But that's also why Kennedy felt like he had to respond by showing how strong he was,
Yeah.
by becoming
Yeah.
more aggressive. So, yeah, I mean, it's extraordinary the way a little decision taken one night can have effects not only on those 1,500 men, which is in its own right
Yeah.
awful to consider what happened to those guys, but the decisions, the events, how they unraveled after that, out of this one decision. Khrushchev's perception of Kennedy feeling he has to change that perception, and this tit for tat thing. And of course, the ultimate tat in all this was nuclear war, which is, what both made them do strange things, Kennedy, but also, made him want to back off from confrontation.
In the context of why did he do various things? When the Kennedy, I'm pretty sure my recollection is correct about this.
Mm-hmm.
It is something about which I mean literally never see anybody write. But a philosophy came in with the Kennedys which took over the country extensively for a few years. And of course, I was just at the time, I was just starting law school. So I was just at that impressionable time when what the President of the United States says is the correct philosophy, you don't just brush it aside like I would today and say, hey, baloney, and it was the philosophy of keep all your options open.
Right.
What a disaster that philosophy is, because it ends up precluding you, not necessarily in logic, but in fact, it ends up precluding you from going down full bore the road that you must go down to be successful. That's the way I conceive of it anyway. And I seem to think that in those days, I remember that it was keep your options open. We're not going to do this, we're going to see. We're going to see what happens.
Was very much the Kennedy way of operating. But I would say that led him to disaster sometimes. Certainly that led partly to bad decision-making in the lead up to the Bay of Pigs. It was just a badly run organization of the White House. Was not well run. It was very ad hoc. It was people coming into meetings, throwing ideas out without there ever being a definite plan written down that everybody was on board with.
I'm going to interrupt you. I'm going to be very rude and interrupt you.
Yeah, please. That's fine.
Because I think you've said something. You may not want to answer this question, but that's exactly what they say about the current White House.
Well, I think what is said about the current White House is different now than it was when it began. I think you have to have a little forgiveness for administrations early in their tenures, because it's new to everybody. I mean, imagine coming in and you're handed this, and the president's never been president. None of the people they've never done this job before. They may be very smart people, and they're coming in to run huge bureaucracies, and every decision they make, the fate of the world seems to depend on. Now, I would push back a little bit on the idea of open options with Kennedy. I think it worked badly in some cases, but I think in the case of the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy did want to keep his options open. And I think in retrospect, thank goodness for that week, first week, where everybody would come into these meetings, and many people changed their minds through the course of that, and probably for the better. I actually, we're sitting there's a jury room here, and I've been on jury duty a few times, and I'm always struck by when you sit down in a jury room after having heard a trial, you think one thing, and you take a vote, say at the very beginning, and maybe it's 10 to 2, and then you start to talk, and reasons start to come out, and you go, well, I didn't think about that. That's actually a good point. And people start to move. And I think, in general, juries move towards the right opinion. They move towards not the right, but they tend to find the truth. And it's partly through keeping an open mind and discussing it. And I think that can be, sometimes we think we know what we believe, and then when it's tested, we realize maybe not. And I that's not to say that you can be flailing all over the place. Certainly presidents can't be doing that. They have to have clear lines. But there are times, I think, when an open mind is very important. In fact, I worry, we have the next president, whoever he is going to face a Cuban Missile Crisis-like situation, possibly when Iran, if and when Iran acquires a nuclear weapon. And I hope that they have meetings, whoever's White House it is, where people do feel free to speak openly and say things that may be contrarian. I hope that groupthink doesn't grab a hold too early of that administration, so that a number of ideas are thought about, and that in the end, the best decision, whatever it is reached.
It's a tremendous change to go from being a senator to being president. In the first months, it's are very difficult. But I have no reason to believe that a president with the powers of this office and the responsibilities placed on it, if he has a judgment that some things need to be done, I think he can do it just as well the second time as the first, depending, of course, on the makeup of the Congress. The fact is, I think the Congress looks more powerful sitting here than it did when I was there in the Congress. But that's because when you're in Congress, you're one of 100 in the Senate or one of 435 in the House. So that the power is so divided. But from here, I look at a Congress, and I look at the collective power of the Congress, particularly the block action, which if it wants to, and it's a substantial power.
I think and I hope that this is not something purely personal, but maybe as part of organizational theory today. I really don't know. When we have meetings around here of importance, I like to have people do memoranda in advance about the pros and cons of this, that, and the other.
Right.
And then open up the meeting to shooting down everything that was said. And that's not as polar as either being very stiff like perhaps Eisenhower was, because he had been in the Army, you have memos, you have this and that, or Kennedy or maybe Obama, which you get the impression that it's a free-for-all. This is kind of a controlled free-for-all, I would think. But anyway, I don't know whether that's a part of today's organizational theory, but I would say that if it's not, it should be.
Now, what was your relation to the consensus? Did you form no opinion until a consensus appeared, or were you part of forming the consensus? And had you disagreed with it, what then?
Well, I think that, you know, that old story about Abraham Lincoln in the cabinet. He says, all in favor say aye, and the whole cabinet voted aye, and then all opposed no, and Lincoln voted no, and he said the vote is no. So that naturally the Constitution places the responsibility on the president. There was some disagreement with the course we finally adopted, but the course we finally adopted had the advantage of permitting other steps if this one was unsuccessful. In other words, we were starting, in a sense, at a minimum place. Then, if that were unsuccessful, we could have gradually stepped it up until we had gone into a much more massive action, which might have become necessary if the first step had been unsuccessful. I would think that the majority finally came to accept that, though at the beginning there was a much sharper division. And after all, this was very valuable because the people who were involved had particular responsibilities of their own. Mr. McNamara, Secretary of Defense, who therefore had to advise me on the military capacity of the United States in that area, the Secretary of State, who had to advise on the attitude of the OAS and NATO, so that, in my opinion, the majority came to accept the course we finally took. It made it much easier. The Cuba of 1961, the advice of those who were brought in on the executive branch was also unanimous, and the advice was wrong. So that, and I was responsible, so it finally comes down that no matter how many advisors you have, frequently they are divided, and the president must finally choose.
One of the unfortunate things was that Kennedy, because of the way that he was running his administration, at least early on, it was very free-flowing, very ad hoc. The plan never really got written down. So he never seemed to know exactly what the plan was. You know, even a week before the invasion, he was talking about parts of it that weren't in it. He didn't seem to know whether it was 700 men going in or 1,400 men. He didn't seem to know how many planes were supposed to be part of the airstrike. The night that he canceled the airstrikes, the second set of airstrikes, April 16th, his words to Dean Rusk were, "I'm not signed on to this. I'm not signed on to these airstrikes." In fact, he'd signed on to this program, all of it. It had all been written down, and I've read those papers. But we don't know, you know, we all know that presidents and other leaders don't necessarily read every single word put in front of them.
Oh, for sure.
And, you know, William Bundy, who was Assistant Secretary of Defense, brother of McGeorge Bundy, he said, you know, it's really the responsibility of those who are doing the briefing to make sure that the person receiving the briefing understands the message. And I don't know whether or not the CIA briefers, how clear they were with Kennedy. I wish we had tape recordings of those meetings. Kennedy had not installed the tape recording device yet that he later had in the Cuban Missile Crisis, so we don't know what the emphasis was in those briefings. But nonetheless, the plan seemed to be this very amorphous thing all the way through until the actual invasion date.
That's fundamentally, isn't it, the fault of the CIA?
It is the fault of the CIA, yes. They should have been, I mean, I think it's the fault, you know, the CIA gets a lot of the blame for it, and they're, you know, particularly that they were trying to sell this operation to the president.
And they were not military planners.
And they were not military planners. And their responses, Alan Dulles said, yeah, but it wasn't our job to point out all the flaws in the plan. You know, this was our plan. It's kind of like, you know, expecting a playwright to write a review of his own play. It was the job of other people to come in and critique the plan. I think a person who really fell short here, I mentioned William Bundy. I think McGeorge Bundy, the National Security Advisor, fell short, and he knew he fell short, because he should have been the channel to Kennedy to clarify exactly what the plan was and what the options were. And he did try to do that on a number of occasions, but he didn't really succeed at it. If Kennedy was unclear of particulars and exactly what he was approving, I think McGeorge Bundy gets some blame for that. And he knew it. He offered his resignation afterwards. In fact, what Kennedy did is brought him closer. And Bundy wrote some really interesting memos to Kennedy right afterwards about administration, saying, we really have to get a hold of this. Too many ad hoc things. We have meetings. Sometimes you call them off at the last minute. You come to meetings, you want to talk about what was in the newspaper that day. It's almost a funny memo where he's saying, you know, maybe there's another time we could do the newspaper conversation, but let's, you know, we have to have one time every day where we really get together seriously and talk about these issues and have clarity. Also, you know, it was right after the Bay of Pigs that Bundy opened up the famous Situation Room. There'd been no such thing before the Bay of Pigs, but he thought there has to be a command and control center within the White House where we can get all this information to Kennedy. Bundy's thought was that Kennedy needed more information, real-time information, to get rid of the mediation of the CIA or the Pentagon. I mean, that would be a great thing to just get live cables coming in. I'm not sure that really should have been the lesson of the Bay of Pigs. The problem wasn't that Kennedy was getting too much information. It's that he wasn't getting it boiled down for him in a really comprehensible way where he could make good decisions on it.
You know, what you're talking about is, I think, a common fault of the academic world. And sometimes it's even brought to light. But John Kenneth Galbraith used to sneer about meetings, academics or otherwise, because they're, you know, to him they were just an effort for people to be able to blow off and try and impress other people. And when you go to these meetings that are free-flowing, that don't come in with an agenda, where you don't have specific questions you're going to address, and then you proceed to address them one at a time, and you proceed to take notes on what is decided and why. Well, you're just a blooming disaster. And this, you know, this is what I hear from all of this stuff.
The communist bloc would like to see the entire world under communist domination. Aggressive war would be a reckless and costly gamble. They have begun to talk more and more their ability to win from us in the arena of ideas.
Massachusetts School of Law. Legal education that is practical, accessible, affordable, and enjoyable. Offering flexible day and evening classes, full or part-time studies, where candidates are assessed not on the LSAT, but their academic and other accomplishments, providing more professional skills training than any other law school in New England. Massachusetts School of Law. Visit us at mslaw.edu, training students to become successful lawyers and advocates, not just legal scholars.
I want to express my great appreciation to the brigade for making the United States the custodian of this flag. I can assure you that this flag will be returned to this brigade in a free Havana.
after the Bay of Pigs, Robert Kennedy seemed to be aware. He wrote a memo to his brother indicating that the Russians might put missiles in Cuba. How did he figure that out, and why did they take no action in advance?
It wasn't that he had any information the Russians were going to put missiles into Cuba. He was afraid, he was worried about it. This was on April 19th, as the invasion is failing on the beaches. He writes this rather extraordinary memo in which he says, we've got to strike back. We can't let this happen. We got to go back and get Castro. Really, this is the blueprint for redoubling the effort to get rid of Castro. Because if we don't do this, before we know it, there are going to be missiles, Soviet missiles, in Cuba. It is a pretty extraordinary thing to read. I mean, particularly, you know, looking back on it now as we are at the time of the 50th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis. But what, you know, the really striking thing is, it's amazing how everything the United States did regarding Castro, it seemed to have exactly the opposite effect of what it was supposed to have. I mean, the Bay of Pigs was supposed to get rid of Castro. In fact, it only empowered him. It was supposed to detach him from the Soviet Union. In fact, it only accelerated his attachment to the Soviet Union. He went and embraced the Soviet Union after the Bay of Pigs, and the Soviet Union embraced him. And then with these missiles, Robert Kennedy's whole point is we must take these aggressive actions to prevent missiles from coming into Cuba. But of course, what Robert Kennedy did with Operation Mongoose was exactly why Khrushchev went and put those missiles into Cuba. So there's the laws of unintended consequences are you know, in full force through all of this.
They're the only laws that are in full force all the time.
And Murphy's Law.
And Murphy's Law.
Yes.
And what's the law about the Peter Principle?
right.
None of this is good.
Yeah.
None of this is good.
You know, after I met Mr. Khrushchev in Vienna, and they gave us an aide-memoire, it took many weeks to get our answer out through the State Department, coordinate with the British, the French, and the Germans. It took much too long. It seems to me we've been able to speed it up, but this is a constant problem in various departments. There are so many interests that are involved in any decision. No matter what whether the decision is about Africa or Asia, it involves the Europe's desk, it involves the desk of the place, it involves the Defense Department, it might involve the CIA, it frequently involves the Treasury, it might involve the World Bank, or it involves the United Nations delegation. So it seems to me that one of the functions of the President is try to have it move with more speed. Otherwise, you can wait while the world collapses.
And Castro, of course, I gather, was willing to fight it out in the Cuban Missile Crisis or anything, because he knew they're going to try and kill him. So why not?
Castro wrote some extraordinary memos to Khrushchev during the Cuban Missile Crisis. He was ready for nuclear war, and I think it was that idea that, you know, we have nothing to lose. We're going to get taken over anyway by the United States if the Soviet Union doesn't stand up to them. He was in his youth, he was a very warmongering kind of guy. I mean, kind of
Castro, yeah.
Castro was, he was ready to thank God Castro didn't have control of those nuclear weapons.
President's responsibility in foreign affairs. Now, when some congressmen disagreed with your course of action over Cuba on that Monday, the responsibility you had by the Constitution was very clear. But in domestic matters where the responsibility is divided, how do you use the presidency, in Theodore Roosevelt's phrase, the bully pulpit, to move these men who really are kind of barons and sovereigns in their own right up there on the hill? Have you any way to move them toward a course of action which you think is imperative?
Well, the Constitution and the development of the Congress all give advantage to delay. It's very easy to defeat a bill in the Congress. It's much more difficult to pass one. To go through a committee, say the Ways and Means Committee of the House, a subcommittee and get a majority vote, the full committee, get a majority vote, go to the Rules Committee and get a rule, go to the floor of the House and get a majority. Start over again in the Senate, subcommittee and full committee, and in the Senate there is unlimited debate, so you can never bring a matter to a vote if there's enough determination on the part of the opponents, even if they're a minority, to go through the Senate with the bill. And then unanimously get a conference between the House and Senate to adjust the bill, or if one member objects, to have it go back through the Rules Committee, back through the Congress, and have this done on a controversial piece of legislation where powerful groups are opposing it. That's an extremely difficult task. So that the struggle for a president who has a program to move it through the Congress, particularly when the seniority system may place particular individuals in key positions who may be wholly unsympathetic to your program, maybe even though they're members of your own party in political opposition to the president. This is a struggle which every president who's tried to get a program through has had to deal with.
Well, he was a baseball player and a warmonger.
I just had dinner the other night with somebody who's writing a book about Castro. He said the baseball player thing about him being a great baseball player, and was he just supposedly tried out for the New York Giants? Not true, apparently. I don't have any independent knowledge of that, but apparently that's not true. Apparently Castro was a bad baseball player.
Okay.
He was a good basketball player.
Oh, was he?
Yeah, but you know, whenever you write about history, you learn that these myths, these stories get passed along, and the good ones never go away because nobody wants to disabuse anybody of them.
Yeah.
Because they're too good.
Yeah, yeah. I gather that the CIA Inspector General wrote an inspection report on the whole business shortly after it occurred, and that got sealed away for decades and decades?
Yes. There were two big reports right after the Bay of Pigs looking into it. One was the Taylor Commission, which was appointed by John Kennedy. Now, you would think that because John Kennedy appointed the commission and because Bobby Kennedy was one of the four members of it, that it would be particularly forgiving of John Kennedy. And it kind of was, but it was not very harsh on the CIA. I was surprised to find that out when I read it. Because the Kennedy administration publicly seemed to be trying to put all the, even though Kennedy came out and said, I am the commander-in-chief, and this in the end is all my responsibility. Really, everybody was leaking the story that the CIA had misled him. Yeah. But I'm amazed by the fact that Kennedy, in this, so the Taylor Commission then sort of gave the CIA a bit of a pass. They said, yes, indeed, CIA did mislead Kennedy, but they kind of put a little bit of blame on Kennedy, which was kind of extraordinary. But the report you're referring to was by Lyman.
That was Maxwell Taylor.
That was Maxwell Taylor, who later had been a general and then later became the chief, head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff under Kennedy.
And a big aficionado of going into Vietnam.
He was. Well, that's a whole other story of how all these people that were either got the United States into the Bay of Pigs, or then, like Taylor, investigated afterwards. Exactly the same folk that then rushed into Vietnam. Yeah. But that's that's an interesting story. But this Lyman Kirkpatrick, who was the Inspector General of the CIA, did write his own report, and it was much harder on the CIA. And it criticized every aspect of the operation. I think, when something fails, it's very easy to go back and say look at every single thing and say, well, everything that CIA did was wrong. It seemed a little unfair, and many people in the CIA thought that this was Kirkpatrick sour grapes, really, because his career had not advanced as far as he'd wanted it to, that he was sort of getting back at people like Richard Bissell. And that was put in a drawer by John McCone, who replaced Allen Dulles as the head of the CIA, and didn't come out many years later. And it's very harsh on the CIA. I don't think it's very fair. I think it's so harsh that it almost misses the point. I mean, it's criticizing the training facilities, the ships that they use. If the thing had worked in some way, nobody would be. It's kind of like, if you watch a football game, the commentators, if the team loses, it's everything wrong they did, and if they win, it's everything right they did. It's not really like that. There are wrong things and right things along the way.
Has your experience in the office matched your expectations? You had studied a good deal, the power of the presidency, the methods of its operation. How has this worked out as you saw it in advance?
Well, in the first place, I think the problems are more difficult than I had imagined they were. Secondly, there's a limitation upon the ability of the United States to solve these problems. We are involved now in the Congo in a very difficult situation. We've been unable to secure an implementation of the policy which we've supported. We are involved in a good many other areas. We are trying to see if a solution can be found to the struggle between Pakistan and India, with whom we want to maintain friendly relations. Yet they're unable to come to an agreement. There is a limitation, in other words, upon the power of the United States to bring about solutions. I think our people get awfully impatient and maybe fatigued and tired and say, we've been carrying this burden for 17 years. Can we lay it down? Well, we can't lay it down, and I don't see how we're going to lay it down in this century. So that I would say that the problems are more difficult than I imagined them to be. The responsibilities placed on the United States are greater than I imagined them to be, and there are greater limitations upon our ability to bring about a favorable result than I had imagined them to be. And I think that's probably true of anyone who becomes president, because there is such a difference between those who advise or speak or legislate and between the man who must select from the various alternatives proposed and say that this shall be the policy of the United States. Well, it's much easier to make the speeches than it is to finally make the judgments, because unfortunately your advisors are frequently divided. If you take the wrong course, and on occasion I have, the president bears the burden, responsibility quite rightly. The advisors may move on to new advice.
The people in Florida who are, well, now the children, grandchildren, and even great-grandchildren of the members of the brigade and of the people who were in charge at the time, do they care about this? Do they care about Cuba? I mean, this is now 50 years later, that's regarded as two generations. Do they still care, or have they become so Americanized that to them it's just water off the back?
Well, I spent some time with the Cuban exiles, those who are still alive. There are a lot of them still around who were in the brigade. Now, they are still as angry as they were in 1961, angry against Castro, and even angry against John Kennedy for abandoning them on the beaches. But they will say their children and grandchildren don't seem to care as much. I mean, they're American, and this is old history to them. But the exiles, they have a museum there. They try to keep the history alive, but it's a bit of a struggle. And one of the guys who was in the brigade said an interesting thing to me about Cuba. He said that he realized he didn't know a single living person in Cuba anymore. I mean, so their ties to Cuba, the men who actually invaded Cuba to get their homeland back, those ties have been severed as well. So, yeah, they definitely feel that the history's being lost, but boy, they still live it. And they talk about the invasion in vivid detail. They have very good memories. They can tell you hour by hour how things went. And what they particularly remember is that sense of abandonment. They all went in there thinking they were going to be backed by the United States. They get there, they find themselves under attack from the air, from artillery, and they realize nobody's coming to their rescue, and these 1,400 men are alone there, just waiting to be slaughtered. And that sense of anger, but it's more than anger, it's a sense of loss, is still very, very powerful and very poignant when you listen to it.
Wasn't that one of the things that became impressed on Americans, starting, for example, with the sailors on the ships, on the American Navy ships, who were told, no, we're not going to blow up those tanks that are on the beach. We are going to get out of the beach area.
Yes, I interviewed a number of men who were young American sailors on American ships that escorted and shadowed the brigade during their invasion. They were just over the horizon, loaded to the gills with weapons. There was an aircraft carrier out there with A-4 Skyhawks on it. And these men who were young at the time, some of them started to cry when I interviewed them, because they felt a sense not of loss, but of having watched somebody drown, of letting this happen, and they could not respond. This was particularly powerful memory for men who were aboard 2 U.S. destroyers, the Eaton and the Murray, that were sent into the Bay of Pigs to basically do some reconnaissance to find out what was going on. And their orders were, find out what's going on there, because communication has been cut off by this point. pick up any survivors you can. Don't fire. Don't fire unless fired upon. Well, so these destroyers go in there. Castro's tank brigade turns towards these and starts firing towards them. Now, Castro's tank leader, I think his name was Fernandez, later said, we were not firing at the destroyers, we were firing at brigademen who were trying to escape in small boats. But these guys aboard these destroyers felt like they were being fired upon. They thought they were being bracketed, which means, you know, a shot fired in front and a shot fired in back, trying to get a target on the destroyers.
Shots.
Yeah, they were, and I spoke to a gunner aboard one of these. Said we were locked and loaded. We were ready to go. The commander saying to them, "Hold fire, hold fire, hold fire." They were ready, and he said he wished they'd been hit because they would have opened fire and they would have blown them away. I mean, these two destroyers would have ended this thing instantly. And for this man, it was, you know, it was. You could hear the pain in his voice that they hadn't been able to do this. But what if they had? What if shots had been fired and they had, and it would have become an overt American enterprise at that point? And then what? I mean, that's the thing you have to keep asking. And certainly that was, and that has to give you some sympathy for John Kennedy. He always had to ask, then what? Then what? If that, you know, the minute American overt force is used, this becomes a global struggle with the Soviet Union, and then what? So there are no easy answers to it, but there certainly is, among people who are still alive today, a great deal of raw pain that's still left over.
President Kennedy arrives at the Strategic Air Command's Operations Center near Omaha on his tour of defense installations. Focal point of the President's visit is the underground command post where direct telephone links with the White House and the Pentagon are manned round the clock in case of emergency. During the Cuban crisis, SAC flew more than 2,000 sorties and logged better than 20 million miles in 48,000 hours of flight. In congratulating the men for a fine job well done, the President presents a plaque to General Thomas S. Power, commanding officer. Recognition for the men who are at the ready in defense of their country.
I seem to remember that about 5 or 6 years later, France created, de Gaulle created what was called, I think, the Force de Frappe, or something like that, which in plain English is France developed its own nuclear delivery capability.
Right.
If
Deterrence, essentially, right? It was a deterrence program, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And that part of what de Gaulle was saying was, in unvarnished terms, you cannot depend upon the United States. This from a man whose derriere we saved in World War II, and then who treated our generals and so forth like they were dirt.
All right.
But I wonder whether his thinking was, particularly given what had happened in World War II, I wondered whether his thinking was at all affected by the fact that we had not supported that brigade when push came to shove, and that he then perhaps consequently he felt, I mean, it's a question, did he consequently feel that if the Russians were threatening Western Europe, you cannot depend upon the United States to save Western Europe from the Russians because the United States would be nuclear bombed?
Possibly, yeah. I mean, the strength of the United States was up for question by a lot of people, not just in the United States, not just domestically, but around the world after the Bay of Pigs. But the problem was, you know, it was very difficult to assert American power during the Cold War because, and God knows we tried many ways to do it, either covert activities or going in with conventional warfare as we did in Vietnam. None of them seemed to work, you know, and we couldn't use nukes. So it really was, this was an issue that really bothered every administration from Eisenhower all the way through, well, certainly through Reagan. Like, how do you assert American power? Sure, we have the power to destroy the world, you know, thousands of times over, But what do you do practically?
You know, I have a retrograde opinion about this. I think Grant and Sherman figured it out. America is good at only one kind of war, all-out major league war, where our size and our technological resources and abilities are the determining factors. And anything else, we're no better than the next guy, and we're not even as good.
I think you're right about that. And think about invasions or covert operations or all the attempted interventions that we've had starting in the 1950s all the way through to now. How many of them have worked? I mean, even if they worked in the short term, we thought that Iran and Guatemala worked in the short term. Look what happened in those countries afterwards, in large part because of our interventions. Yeah, that's the thing. But then interventions basically generally fail. I mean, occasionally we get lucky, but generally they're disasters for the United States. But then what are we supposed to do? Are we supposed to not, just sit back and stay out of things and not assert American authority? No president can do that. We put a premium on our presidents being strong and tough, and no president would last if he said, I'm just going to stay out of, these things around the world. I'm not going to try to, manipulate events or influence events. That wouldn't work very well.
If you were to write a book on it, I will be first at your door asking to interview you.
Okay.
I hope somebody does write a book on it.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. Been a delightful opportunity to speak
Well, thank
with
you.
here.
Enjoyed it.
And to the audience, thank you for being with us too, and be with us again next time for the next installment of Books of Our Time.